Hi, everyone. Sorry for the delay. We did run into a bit of a technical issue with capacity for our Zoom meeting. But luckily, we're going to be recording this, so we'll be able to share the recording with those who are actually unable to come in. Julia is working behind the scenes just to see if there's anything we can do to sort this out. So I'd just like to start by saying thank you for joining us today for the CAC's Reconciliation Working Group's first panel discussion. My name's Lauren Osmond. I'm one of the RWG co-secretaries, and I'm excited to be joining you all today. It's been a long time coming. We are convening virtually from a variety of different time zones and situated on many different territories. I'd like to acknowledge that the CAC Administrative Office is situated on unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. These lands of the Anishinaabe peoples are also where I'm speaking from today. I recently moved to this region in what is now called Gatineau, a city on the north side of the Kichisibi, or Great River, which runs northwest to southeast, fed by tributaries from the south and the north. With many sacred sites located on or near these waterways, they've been used by Indigenous peoples for millennia and embody sustenance, culture, and connection. Today they connect me to Charlotte Parent by way of the St. Lawrence, which connects us to Julia Campbell-Such on the north side of Lake Ontario. I'd like to express how honored I am to share the RWG co-secretary role with these two strong women. For the past few years, the CAC membership and board have been receiving updates and emails from the three of us. So I wanted to quickly take this public opportunity to put faces to names. So I'm just gonna introduce you to Charlotte.
Hi everyone, I'm Charlotte Parent. I'm a Quebecois settler. I live in Montreal on the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka, the custodians of the island's lands and water. They know the city as Tiohtià:ke, which means broken in two, or where the currents meet, because the island breaks the St. Lawrence River in two. The Kanien'kehá:ka name for the river is Kaniadalowanene, or Big Waterway. The river has taken Indigenous people to Montreal since time immemorial. The island has always been a place of meeting and exchange and has a rich history of occupation and stewardship by people, including the Iroquoians of the St. Lawrence and the Anishinaabe. In Anishinaabe-Mowin, the island is known as Moniyang.
Hi.
Julia.
Hi. I'm Julia Campbell-Such. Right now I'm in the city of Toronto on the land of the Mississauga of the Credit, land also shared at various points in history between Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples under the Dish with One Spoon and other treaties. Many creeks and rivers that were used for travel and trade between these peoples on this land were buried by my settler ancestors. One of these, Garrison Creek, is just a few blocks from where I'm sitting. This creek flowed into Lake Ontario and connected the lake to the Beach Trail trading route, which is now called Davenport Road. If you go there, you can see the ground around this site is still often wet where the creek is buried. Recently, local Indigenous groups have begun to reclaim this site, planting native plants in a garden and painting murals at the Bickford Community Center, which is built right on top of the creek. So today I just want to acknowledge them for the work they've been doing, preserving the heritage of that site.
Great. Thanks, Julia and Charlotte. So before we get started, we'd like to remind people of how we work. If you've not already read our communications guidelines, which we sent via email, please do so following the link that Charlotte's going to pop in the chat. The 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission report concluded that the Canadian residential school system was cultural genocide. The CAC's RWG exists to bring the CAC into compliance with UNDRIP and to answer the calls to action issued by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So our goal is to change our institutional structures, practices and guiding documents, including the Code of Ethics and Guidelines for Practice, to recognize, respect, and defer to Indigenous perspectives in the conservation of materials of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis origin. Today, we're asking everyone to reflect on colonial practices in cultural heritage conservation, and we want to do so in a respectful, open, and caring way. So if ever you find the discussion to maybe be a bit too much, please feel free to take a break or step away. We also want to mention 2 helplines that can be called if you need to talk with someone, and Charlotte's going to pop those in the chat as well. So this panel, as I mentioned, will be recorded and made accessible on the RWG blog, which you can also find more information about the RWG on. We'll start with presentations, followed by a panel discussion, and end with time for questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat so we can form a list for the end and ask them on your behalf. Lastly, we would like to thank our volunteers for all the help they're giving us running this event, and a huge thank you to Heidi Swierenga for moderating this discussion, and to Sean, Meranda, and John for sharing with us. Heidi is an object conservator specializing in the care and use of Indigenous belongings. She is senior conservator at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC in Vancouver, and head of the collection's care, management, and access department. She's also an active member of the RWG, and with that, I'm going to pass it over to Heidi.
Thanks, Lauren. Am I unmuted? Yes. Sorry, hang on. I just wanted to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you again from the traditional and unceded territories of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people, where I practice conservation, as Lauren said, at the Museum of Anthropology at UBC. And it's really an immense privilege to be on Musqueam's territory. This resulted in the creation of valued relationship that we have. And the guidance and the direction that we have received from Musqueam and other nations has influenced our institution in multiple ways, including our conservation practice, which really is of most relevance here. And I'm really, really honored to be moderating this really important discussion, and I'm delighted to be able to introduce to you now our 3 panelists who will be sharing their professional experiences relating to colonial practices in conservation. Our first speaker will be John Moses. John is presently the manager of the Combined Object, Paper, and Archaeological Conservation Treatment Labs at the Canadian Conservation Institute. And his participation in today's panel is informed by 30 years experience working with national collections as an artifact conservator, Indigenous history researcher, policy analyst, and repatriation supervisor. Our second speaker is Meranda Roberts. Meranda is an enrolled member of the Yarrington Paiute tribe in Nevada, as well as Chicana. In 2018, she earned her PhD from the University of California, Riverside in Native American history. And over the past few years, she's been working as a postdoctoral researcher at the Field Museum of Natural History, where she's been developing content for the renovation of the museum's 70-year-old Native American exhibit hall. And our final speaker is Sean Young. Sean is a collections manager and archaeologist at the Haida Gwaii Museum. And he's an experienced archaeologist and educator who's been organizing repatriations in his community for many years. I want to thank you all for your time here and your contributions. John, I welcome you to go ahead now with your talk, if you're able.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Great, okay. Niawe, Sego, Skenagawaga, Sawadis Moses, Young Yats, Ganyats Young Wahoy, Ganyatse Hodnoshoni, Ganyangahega Tano Lene Lenape. My name is John Moses. I'm a member of the Delaware and Upper Mohawk bands at the Six Nations of the Grand River Territory near Brantford, Ontario, which is where both my parents were born and raised and where the majority of my extended family members continue to live and work. My father was the late Russ Moses. He was a residential school survivor, a naval veteran of the Korean War, and a federal public servant whose various appointments included being Deputy Commissioner General of the Indians of Canada Pavilion at Montreal's Expo 67. My mother is Helen Montour Moses. She followed her own mother, Edith Anderson Montour, into the nursing profession, and Helen was a founding member of the original Canadian Indian Nurses Association back in the 1970s. Helen turns 91 next month and lives here in Ottawa. I'm telling you all of this so you know exactly who I am and where I'm coming from and the various life experiences that inform my outlook. Now, I want to acknowledge, of course, our Indigenous veterans and elders and the traditional Indigenous territory of the Anishinaabe from which I'm joining you today. The following views and perspectives are mine alone, based on my own lived experience and accumulated body of traditional and professional knowledge, and do not necessarily reflect those of my employers, nor are they presented in the context of any specific museum controversy. My comments today apply to the current state of Canadian museums, heritage, and conservation practice in general. There is much talk these days of decolonizing, indigenizing, and unsettling museums and gallery spaces in Canada. It is my contention that the groundbreaking, paradigm-shifting Indians of Canada Pavilion at Montreal's Expo 67 was ground zero for all of that. The pavilion was a watershed in Indigenous self-representation before national and global audiences, and everything Indigenous peoples have done in the meantime in the context of museums, galleries, and related spaces is an attempt to regain and restore that degree of cultural sovereignty and autonomy in respect of telling our own stories, both on our own terms and in our own terms. I'll return to the pavilion later. Now, having said that, I want to acknowledge, of course, that museums, both historically and as presently configured, are fundamentally colonial spaces, that colonialism is to be repudiated, and that therefore museums are potentially awful places in relation to Indigenous peoples. That's understood. Every museum, heritage, and conservation professional must be aware of and acknowledge this state of affairs. Demonstrating and manifesting a knowledge of such matters is not to take a strident political or ideological stance. It is, simply put, another measure of the professional competence of anyone in our field, regardless of their subdiscipline, that they are aware that Indigenous sensitivities exist in respective museums, heritage, and conservation practice. Indigenous peoples do not passively accept museum practices, including conservation, as unquestioned social goods. As an Indigenous expert on Indigenous issues, including in respect of museums, heritage, and conservation, I can tell you that we are more concerned with identifying how Indigenous ancestor objects, now in museums, came to leave Indigenous hands and communities in the first place through what I call dissociation through an Indigenous lens, and how to retrieve the intangible heritage values and traditional knowledge, including language and special terminologies and vocabularies embedded within them. For me, the immediate task at hand is how to decolonize, indigenize, and unsettle existing institutions while planning for new Indigenous-led cultural spaces of the future. To unpack these terms specifically, museum decolonization involves rethinking conventional museum governance models and management practices and replacing these with Indigenous-inspired systems for consensus decision-making that determine levels of responsibility, accountability, consultation, and information sharing, while indigenization itself is the process of privileging Indigenous views and perspectives on any subject matter being dealt with, including conservation in the museum setting. Unsettling is the process of changing organizational behaviors and practices, especially in the area of staffing and human resources, such that the recruitment, retention, and career advancement of Indigenous experts on Indigenous issues across the spectrum of museum disciplines is prioritized. Many recruitment practices, including those for publicly funded museums, galleries, and conservation institutes, remain wedded to a concept of diversity and inclusion that sees Indigenous peoples as merely another tile in Canada's ethnocultural mosaic, beneath an overarching mythology of the French and the English as the two founding nations. The reality, however, is that Indigenous peoples have constitutionally protected Section 35 Aboriginal and treaty rights, which do not accrue to other groups, and which must be reflected in institutional staffing and hiring practices, leading to special measures for the recruitment, retention, and career advancement of Indigenous employees. Moreover, any contemplated conduct by Crown entities, including national and provincial museums, that is perceived as having a potentially negative impact on Section 35 Aboriginal and treaty rights may trigger assertions of the legal duty to consult and accommodate the views and perspectives of Section 35 Aboriginal rights holders. Accordingly, all institutional planning documents should include a mandatory legal duty to consult and Aboriginal and treaty rights compliance paragraph along these lines. Quote, is there any aspect of this proposal whatsoever that might trigger assertions of the legal duty to consult, or that raises any other concerns in respect of Aboriginal and treaty rights compliance, including in respect of Canada's support of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, end of quote. Just so you know, the most specific museum-related provisions of UNDRIP, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, are to be found at Articles 11, 12, and 31. So I would recommend these to your attention and that you make them part of your work-related behaviors. Even in the absence of a strict legal duty to consult, it may be wise to engage Indigenous representatives as a matter of principle and good management practices. Now, the discipline of conservation is fundamentally concerned with the chemistry of art and artifacts and identifying and managing the agents of deterioration. Having said that, conservation is ultimately no less a values-laden social practice than it is a technical or scientific pursuit. In respect of conservation itself, my primary interest is in advocating for the personhood and agency of Indigenous ancestor objects in collections and questioning whose values, ethics, and assumptions form the basis of conservation decision-making, whether for individual artifacts and works of art or for entire monuments, historic sites, and cultural landscapes. In respect of museum practices in general, I am obliged to question who gets to speak on whose behalf concerning representations of indigeneity in the museum and gallery space. For me, the ultimate goal is to move beyond the mere representation of Indigenous views and perspectives and attain something near their actual unfiltered presence. The filter down effects for the conservation disciplines would include the rise of a unique Indigenous conservation ethic and practice that would prioritize the retention and reclamation of Indigenous traditional knowledge systems, including languages, oral histories, and reassociating Indigenous ancestor objects, whether in museums or communities, with their authentic Indigenous language terminologies. On a practical level, organizations and institutions looking to facilitate outreach, engagement, and consultation with visiting Indigenous delegations to view and discuss collections must anticipate and manage real-world challenges. These include making Indigenous rights holders aware of the range of federal and other programs to which they might apply to enable collections visits and facilitating their applications to do so, setting aside sufficient funds each year for Indigenous engagement and consultation-related travel and accommodation, and finally, providing special meeting places in the museum itself, whether in existing boardrooms, exhibition galleries, conservation labs, or collection storage spaces that have the range of special features necessary to enable smudging, ritual feeding, and other aspects of Indigenous traditional care. Ideal building design features include privacy, the ability to disengage sensors and alarms, high efficiency systems for ventilation, and easy access to the outdoors and specially landscaped green spaces that are likewise appropriate and conducive to traditional care. The provision of these features needs to be mandated in board-approved institutional policy documents that cite the institution's commitment and adherence to the principles of UNDRIP and Canada's reconciliation agenda with Indigenous peoples as their source, so that conservators and other staff do not have to argue for such accommodations with every visit. Finally, visitors must be provided all necessary personal protective equipment and be fully briefed to UNDRIP standards for FPIC, meaning free, prior, and informed consent, regarding the potential for pesticide residues on the surfaces of the ancestor objects they may be viewing and handling, and meet with conservators to discuss testing and remediation options and safe handling guidelines. Now, having stated all of that, I want to stress that repatriation is but one possible outcome along a spectrum of Indigenous access to collections measures. Indigenous access comprises a range of activities spanning the provision of specialized training for Indigenous interns in the museum and gallery setting, to individually negotiated custodial arrangements agreements whereby museum materials are effectively shared between Indigenous communities and museums, to indeed the permanent return and transfer of the legal title of Indigenous ancestor objects back to their communities of origin or present-day populations proving descent. For institutions, I advocate a criteria-based repatriation policy. Such a policy prioritizes the return of human remains and associated grave goods, sacred, ritual, or ceremonial objects, objects that were obtained under duress or conditions of theft or trespass onto Indigenous traditional territories, objects that may spur the retention, revitalization, and reclamation of Indigenous languages and oral histories, and finally, objects of outstanding artistic or creative merit and achievement. Now, having considered all of these matters for some time now, my personal and professional conclusions are that the time has come for a national Indigenous exhibition and research center in this country with a mandate to acquire national collections. Such a facility would be financed via federal startup monies from the Government of Canada as a flagship reconciliation initiative, annual appropriations from Parliament thereafter, and a special tax to be levied against private sector proponents advocating development within Indigenous traditional territories. The ongoing pursuit of private philanthropy would also be a fixed priority. The facility would be led with Indigenous board governance provided by a circle of Indigenous elders, veterans, youth, artists, and academic representatives, and it would prioritize the hiring of Indigenous experts on Indigenous issues. The facility would be explicitly modeled after the spirit and intent of the original Indians of Canada Pavilion at Expo 67, and it would strive to establish itself as a career destination and employer of choice for Indigenous practitioners in the museum field and across the spectrum of its disciplines. That's the big picture. In terms of the implementation of the Indigenous agenda right now at my current employer, the Canadian Conservation Institute, I am pleased to convey to you this evening that reference to a proposed 2-year National Indigenous Development Program for an Indigenous Conservator in Training has made it into print in the PCH Department of Canadian Heritage Departmental Plan. Other proposals I have put forward for consideration also include a 6-month mid-career Indigenous Artist in Residence program to explore traditional materials and techniques in a conservation setting, and a prototype experimental Indigenous traditional care lab at CCI to serve as both an administrative hub and physical hub for the NIDP and the craftsperson in residence. So stay tuned concerning these developments. Thank you for your time this evening, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers and participating in the panel discussion. Yahweh Goa, thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for that. I wanted to remind people, for all of you who have questions, we are going to hold them at the end after the discussion. So I welcome you to put them into the chat, and there they will be pulled for use later on at the end. Meranda, are you ready to give your talk?
Yes. I don't know if I could follow that. That was amazing, John. Thank you for your words and for what you do. And thank you, Heidi, for your introduction earlier. Thank you also for allowing me to be in this space. I am in the United States right now in traditional Kumeyaay territory, which is in San Diego. And also reflecting as we were talking, I'm only about 15 minutes from the Mexico border where my other Indigenous relatives are from, and reflecting on how there are kids in cages not too far from where I'm at. Mm-hmm. So as I do this presentation here today, the passion that I am exuding comes from that reality in which I am living in and a part of. So that is how I will start. And I have a presentation, and just as a caveat, the presentation is kind of organized in how I kind of produce my thought processes anyway. And I take things and I block in blocks and really try to contemplate them and think about them. So I will go ahead and share my screen. And let me just. Okay, perfect. So hi again, everybody. I'm Meranda Roberts. I'm Northern Paiute and Chicana, and for those who are not familiar, Chicana is a part of the cultural community here in Los Angeles families who had family in Mexico immigrate, and second, third generation in Los Angeles, really creating their own culture here based off of those experiences. I am currently a co-curator and postdoc researcher at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago, Illinois. And as a disclaimer, as was shown to me earlier with this, anything that I will talk about here today is based solely on all of the experiences I have at several large institutions, including and not limited to the Field Museum. These are all of my own opinions and my own observations, and are based in my own form of activism. And that's not to say that it is for everybody, but it is how I feel it gets the message across to how we can work better in institutions that were not made for us to begin with. And so these perspectives, again, are not based off of any one person or group. They are just my reflections, and things that will be said here are in kindness and in love for my communities, and not out of any sort of anger or frustration towards anything. So as I was developing my presentation here today, I took the questions that were in the description for this program today and really started to think them through, really started to be like, well, what does it mean to confront colonial biases? And having the experiences I had to confront this on a daily basis in many different aspects. And on many times, I don't understand the scientific approach to what goes into conservation, and that is not something I will ever take away, because you have to go through so much education to get to that point, and that is honorable to me. I really do understand that that is a set of educational logistics that I don't understand. However, when you have a group of items and ancestors that were taken from your families and your communities, how do we get to the point of bringing the conversations with Indigenous people who have that knowledge that sustained those items for centuries into conversation with people who have an education and certain the longevity of items that they are not a part of the culture. So really just kind of sitting through these questions and thinking them through. And all of the next things are just what I kind of are like my answers to those questions as we're moving forward. And settlers, and not all settlers, but I'm just talking mostly about those who have to, well, settlers, not those who were forcibly brought over, enslaved people are not a part of that conversation, which I'm talking about. But when I am confronted with, I want to say the colonial biases of an institution, it is often in the front of that we love that the institution or group of people love to say that they love to collaborate with this Indigenous people, that that's what they do, they are experts in it. However, when an opposing opinion usually arises, there's conflict that starts. And then usually it goes back to that dialogue that I was just talking about of the educational aspect that goes into conservation to acquire a degree versus the Indigenous held knowledge that is there in the community that has been passed on for generations. And oftentimes, because we live in this Western society with Western education, that Westernized model is preferred because that is what's comfortable, that is what is easier, that is what the colonizers have deemed as the acceptable form of knowledge. And so there's conflict there. And it often is a reflection of the settler colonialism, of white privilege, wealth privilege, and a lot of other different aspects that go into this. And so as this is happening, as you have these two groups that are usually Indigenous led and then either museum led or any sort, even if it's a private conservationist, they usually lean into the colonial system that they benefit from to protect them, their values, and their education, because that is what they know. And again, I don't know what it means to have that aspect to my education. I approach every aspect of my work through a indigenous person's lens. I place that above everything else, even though I have degrees that allow me access into these spaces and I understand the Western framework. I put my indigeneity above all else. So I don't know what it means to situate my education or my background in that way above this. But what I do know is that if you have someone like me who's very passionate about what they are doing and providing the right means of resources for their communities so that they are conserved the proper way that they should, coming in and telling you, I don't think it's right, or I don't think this is it, I can understand how frustrating and I don't want to say horrendous, but how tightening that could be, questioning your whole body as who you are, as to what you've been trained in, and imagine what that can do to you, and what that could do to your frame of mind. However, but when that happens, as the indigenous people are asking you to place sacred medicine inside of a case where there's a bundle on display, because out of respect, and asking them to smudge the room, as John was pointing out, all of those contingency things that will make a space more indigenous. What usually happens is if a person or a group of people don't agree with what the indigenous person is saying, and they're leaning into their privilege, then they start to see the indigenous person and the people themselves as a threat to their knowledge base and their educational system. Meaning, who is this person who was not trained in the education that I am to say X, Y, or Z? And that is the basis of colonialism. That is the basis of working in a space that was created with the idea that Native American or indigenous people, First Nations people would not survive past a certain time frame, and therefore were viewed as inferior. So it repositions and it continues those dialogues of who is inferior and who is superior. And it is up to us as educators in these fields to do away with those models, or to reset those models and say completely that, or admit completely that you as a person, as an organization, have a set of privileges that don't benefit and have never benefited indigenous people, and need to be self-reflective on how you can make more accommodations to ensure that the indigenous voices and sense of purpose is placed before all else. Excuse me. And to me, as we are in these spaces, and just yesterday, and excuse me if I get emotional, just yesterday, I was at the Museum of Us, which is here in San Diego, and I encountered ancestors for the first time in a museum setting, meaning their human remains, and including a child, and with dust on the boxes of these items, and thinking about how my work, even though it can be extreme and I can say things that are a little bit more based in a activist lens, are important, because I still have ancestors in boxes without being properly. It's not the fault of the museum, because they're doing everything they can. This is a great model. Everyone should look into the Museum of Us. But how can I not keep saying that museums as a whole are the foundations and uphold white supremacy if my ancestors and children and their cultural items are still in boxes that are dusty and in a cabinet somewhere where no one knows where they were shipped from the ground that they were brought up from to an institution for scientific purposes? How can I not keep saying what I am, especially then as we think about that there's children being separated 15 miles from me, from their families, in many of the same ways that our children in boarding schools were separated from our communities. And that model is still continuing. So if you want to call yourself a collaborator, you have to not police my reaction to, or anyone's reaction to, these real world events, as John was pointing out, to what we are experiencing here today. we are bringing in a lot of, I don't want to say baggage because that's not appropriate, but we're bringing in a lot of lived experience from different points of view. And when we come into a space and we're asking a conservator, a collections manager, a white curator to bend the rules, to do something that's different, to allow us to honor the people that we come from, there has to be some more wiggle room than anything. There has to be a sense of trust put into the hands of the indigenous people who created these items to begin with, and never anticipate that they would end up in a space completely separate from their communities. And if they did anticipate that by releasing them under false pretenses of being sold or stolen, imagine how heartbreaking that must have been for those individuals to have lost parts of their cultures that their ancestors made. There is nothing else, like, we had to really think through that my emotions, and that's what my next, we don't live in a monolith. My emotions are a contingency onto the experiences that I have before I even enter the museum itself as a professional. So even though I might be educated in the Western sense of ideas, and I can write in a way that will make academia happy, I am first and foremost a brown person. I am an indigenous woman from here in Mexico. I advocate from that perspective first. And so however I react, if I'm frustrated, if I'm sad, if I'm angry, and all within the confines of obviously like not tolerating any forms of like violence or anything like that, but emotional reactions to witnessing cultural items that you may have been related to in a storage unit that was then, that craft itself was lost to time, or you know the story of a cultural item and it was stolen from your home because an anthropologist wanted it and they just took it. Or human remains, as I was saying, the group of people I met, my ancestors, they were just in the ground. Someone was plowing their field in the 1970s, so not that long ago, put them in a box and shipped them to the museum and said, here you go. So I am allowed, and we are allowed to feel how we feel and not have to worry about the ways in which we should act within the confines of a museum, because if we don't act in that way, what does that mean on how we will be treated? Right? How does it mean that there will be no more accommodations because someone else's feelings are being hurt? From what I've observed, and it's not just in conservation, I think as a museum as a whole, as a public institutions as a whole, is this, you separate your feelings from the reality. In Western society, we're not supposed to emulate real world feelings within our professions because that's not what you do, especially in a capitalist society. And that is completely devoid of anything that we are taught as children in indigenous communities, or that we are learned. We share your emotions, show how you feel, and express yourself, and do it in a way that is kind, but with also the perspective of understanding that these things take time to actually accomplish. And so these are things that we should all keep in mind, considering, like it says here, some of us grew up on the reservation. Some of us are unrecognized communities. Some of us were in cities and poverty and wealth as enrolled members, are actively being disenrolled from their communities here in the United States. And so that history of settler colonialism is still affecting us today. And therefore, when we come into a museum and are met with that same coloniality within our face, we're going to have the reactions that we have. And I'm asking everyone here today to just let them be. Let them be, let those emotions be, and feel with us. It doesn't have to be outside of that emotion. Come and learn from us in that setting. And so one thing I say all the time is our relationship to these items is more than just how you might run a light test to preserve its longevity because you're worried about the fading of an item. These items and these pieces and these ancestors are alive. They have love and attention and perspective from their makers that were given to them upon their creation. And I often think, well, what about that maker's want, their hopes? What was their original intention in creating that basket, that cradle board? What was their original intention with anything? And how do we, as a museum educational people, honor those ideas before we honor the science of trying to make sure that it is preserved to sustain however many hundreds of years? Because remember, these pieces a lot of the time were made to go back into the ground or to reuse, be reused, or to be buried with us, or to be burned. And so what are we preserving if we are not preserving above all else the intentions and the love and the history associated with that item, with the people who made it? Very briefly, I know that, sorry, getting a little lost. These, again, museums are double-edged swords. We often have to endure the idea of being happy that things are there, but then they're not, and also being unhappy about them. And despite all of what has happened in the past to us, I ask you all here today, those who benefit from settler colonialism, those who continue to, those who have a discernible degree of privilege, to always stay, to check that privilege, including myself, and hold me accountable as well. So how we can better interact with Indigenous people and do away with the colonial idea that Indigenous people had nothing of worth to forgive to others. We have a wealth of knowledge that you are here learning today. And a part of that means being uncomfortable. And I often end with this is because a lot of times when I do get frustrated, or when people are frustrated at me for what I may say, think about, it was never Indigenous people who asked for settlers to come onto our land through boats and missionary. It was never that wasn't something that we were like, hey, come on over. Like this was something that was planned. And so if you're feeling uncomfortable, if you're feeling like mad at me, for example, think about the actions that your answers had to do to get to that point of you feeling uncomfortable. Because I and my family and my answers did not instigate that. It was something that was forced on us, and it's something that we all have to rectify if we're ever going to move forward as a group of people, not just in the United States or Canada, but as a humanity-based system. We need to confront this and just be okay with confronting it and not blame the Indigenous people for the feelings that are being arisen within yourself. Think about the history of it, and then we can begin to move forward where we no longer have to address it, but we're not there yet. And I don't know if we'll ever be there in my lifetime. And I will just end there. Thank you, and I appreciate it.
Thank you, Miranda, for that. I think it is so important to hear your words, and your perspective brings so much to the conversation. It might be difficult for some people to hear, but how can we move forward with these conversations without multiple perspectives? So I thank you for that. I just wanted to mention to all of the people who are watching, some people are messaging me privately in the chat. Maybe there could be some instruction, because the chat's being moderated by somebody else to pull the questions from. So if I could get Lauren to speak up for a moment and address how you would like those images or the messages to be sent, if it's to the general group or to you personally.
You're welcome to put them to the general group, or if you want to stay anonymous, you can send them directly to Charlotte Perrin, and she's putting together the list.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Lauren.
Mm-hmm.
Sean,
Could I
how
go?
are you feeling? Are you ready to go?
Yeah, I keep getting dropped. It's storming here in Haida Gwaii, so my internet's pretty poor. I got kicked off a bunch of times, but I'll fly at her here.
Okay, see how it goes. Good luck.
I'll share my screen first. So good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Hopefully it works. My name is Kidiaki. My English name is Sean Young. I'm the collections manager and the manager of the Lab of Archaeology at the Haida Gwaii Museum on Haida Gwaii. I'm a member of the CAC-ACCR Raven clan of Kuna Ilnagai, a member of the Haida Nation out here on British Columbia on the Northwest Coast. My presentation, I'm going to talk to a few specific loan items that had a lot of conservation and conservator involvement, with a couple loans that we had with a few museums. One was a chief's chest, which we got from the American Museum of Natural History. It's a picture here in the left hand side, right above Laura Pierce's name. It's my chief in the middle. And the other one, I'll show a picture later. Both objects, the other one came from the Canadian Museum of Natural History, or the Museum of History, sorry. It's a box drum. Sorry, I'm scrambling. I'm trying to hope my internet doesn't fail here. So here's a photo to center everyone. You get a nice little picture. It's storming here, but here is Sutherland and I, the Saving Things house where I work at CAC-ACCR. This is the Haida Gwaii Museum on a beautiful sunny day when the sun does show up. So here are the two objects where we dealt with the colonial conservative system within museums regarding loans. The box drum on the left is a music drum. It's used in ceremony. It's got a beautiful mamachikai, or a dragonfly, painted on one side and a sculpin on the other side. The object here in the black and white is the moon mountain goat chest, which is from Kuna Ilnagai, which is currently at the American Museum of Natural History. And both of these came to Haida Gwaii on loans, long-term loans. One was for 5 years, that was the box drum, and the moon mountain goat chest was for 2 years. Now, both of these objects are ceremonial. They were used in potlatch, burial ceremonies especially. But unfortunately, a bit of a background, both objects came out of a period during the Indian Act time of 1876, and unfortunately with the addition of the potlatch ban of 1884, so the use of such ceremonial objects was illegal under Canadian law. So that's usually how museums are able to collect these, definitely under duress with the fear of being arrested or fined. So these were purchased, especially the moon mountain goat chest around 1901, 1903. The chest especially was unique. It was a burial chest, so that was also not allowed because of the Indian Act. Through the process that we went through with both museums, we had to negotiate with conservators at both museums for the use in the Haida Gwaii Museum, as well as for ceremony, and that's a different ask for objects. I can't speak for other institutions, but the way that we're pretty hands-on, as most nations are. So being conservators, they're pretty conservative, so it was a bit of a tough ask, but we negotiated the loans, and here's a map of Haida Gwaii, kind of showing you the relative location of where those objects were collected. Kuna Ilnagai, arrow pointing to an island, Louise Island, south of Skidegate and Sandspit, and Kaisun Ilnagai on the very rugged west coast of Haida Gwaii. So the conservators and museums, especially the American Museum of Natural History, didn't have a lot of time to prepare for the loan. I think it was around 2 weeks notice they had of the loan approval. It might be textbook, hopefully not, but that's how it went. And what they did, this is a new learning curve for us with conservation practices, how expensive stuff is to handle, to care for, especially the custom crates to be built to house these objects. So in short, they waived a lot of their fees, which was great to help us get this moon mountain goat chest to Haida Gwaii for ceremonial use. In short, it costed around $50,000 American one way to ship this box from New York to Haida Gwaii. So that was with the policies that are in place to move such objects could make it very difficult for people. So that wasn't really easy for museums such as the Haida Gwaii Museum that were very grant driven like most, and we don't have gobs of cash. to do it, but we did our fundraising and we had some awesome allies to help us with the shipping. So very strict in handling and the movement of this object from New York to Vancouver. So this was a bit interesting where it got moved by plane in a custom crate to Vancouver. Now, for anyone, as Heidi knows, we're on the Northwest coast, so stuff starts changing. So negotiations again had to happen with the conservators and the museum on how it's going to be moved from Vancouver. There are no fancy art couriers that are licensed to handle. So we rented a U-Haul truck and sent the director down to drive up with the conservator with the chest, which is definitely breaking out of normal, but they definitely amended the loan and the agreement. And here's the route. If anyone's not familiar with how to get to Haida Gwaii, it's not that easy. It's around 24 hours driving. It's usually done over 2 days. So a lot of stuff was amended with their very colonial, very conservative conservation standards for the loan, but they're willing to work with it to go through this process of going through half of British Columbia to Haida Gwaii, especially taking a ferry, which is not smooth at the best of times for anything to get the Haida Gwaii. When the chest did arrive to Haida Gwaii, it came with the head conservator from the Museum of Natural History, and also the head curator was also present. Now, when the chest showed up at our museum, we always call it island time or Haida Gwaii time. It showed up the night before a potlatch, which it was going to be used for 2 days at a potlatch. Different standards. I'm the collections manager. There's not a lot of staff here. So I relied on clan members. So we moved out of the norm of very conservative conservation practices. And I'm standing with 2 fellow clan members, and we did the unpacking of the chest with the conservator in the museum. And we did it right here in the museum and did a conservation report immediately for the potlatch. And a lot of negotiation was parlayed about how it was going to be presented. We let it be known there's no display case, there's no stanchions, there's nothing. It's at a potlatch. The hereditary chief, who was going to be dressed to be chief, came down to see the chest. His first instinct was to check the paint, which he kind of scraped with his fingernail to check out the mica on the green paint, which is a bit alarming to any conservator to see someone poke at an object. And we realized mica was infused in the paint, which is quite unique. With our inspection with the chest, it was always quoted or in reports as being made out of red cedar. It took us no more than around 5 minutes to realize the chest was made out of yellow cedar mostly, and the lid was red and the base was red, but it took our eye quite easy to figure out that it was yellow cedar of what it was carved out of. One of the interesting dialogues was the interpretation of the object which comes up. It was always quoted as a mountain goat chest. I'm a member of the CAC-ACCR, the Raven clan, which this chest was created, and we have a very large clan. The mountain goat is a crest that we do have within our clan, but the highest crest is the moon, and kind of facing our feet there is the moon, and that's the chief's crest. So we would be stating that this is, we're going to call it the moon chest. So there is an instant difference of opinion, let's say, on what the object was or the interpretation of, because their records would say one thing and we were saying another. Again, with the movement of the chest out of the normal, we just use clan members to drive it to our rec hall for the potlatch. And you could see it here being unloaded with our then director, Scott Marsden, and a few other clan members helping myself unload it. And then we unpacked it in the rec center. You could see a large table full of pies, which is normal in our potlatches, and it's around a lot of food items and a lot of people. And this is a small look at about half the rec center. So we quickly had a discussion with the clan about what they wanted to do with the chest. Conservation standards and what they would like, would have to start massaging to my clan's like, and me being a collections manager, it was very easy because my clan tells me what to do. And I had to work with the conservator and the curator from New York, but we quickly made a really good, it was very comfortable, kind of uncomfortable, comfortable to put it short, because there was around 1,000 people, 700 to 1,000 people at the potlatch, a lot of movement and a lot of foods like this everywhere that usually only exists here on the Northwest coast. So here again with the change of how we're doing it, we kind of stood with it, with the chest. We let the public be a part of it. We wouldn't remove them from it as we would in the museum behind a glass case. They were part of it. We put it on a beautiful milled piece of red cedar on hardwood dollies so we can roll it around so elders and the public could see it. Everyone was very good at the potlatch. The conservator and the curator were quite happy of how people oriented themselves around it. I know there's a lot of hesitation, especially by myself, because I was responsible for this in the public, and trying to balance between that very colonial conservative world of conservation as well as my own people's ask of what they wanted with it. A lot of dancing and ceremony. And I kind of put this slide in here to show of the objects we have in our collection. We use them all the time. We don't like letting them sit in a display case. We want to dance them, that we want them to be a part of this ceremony, especially with that chest we got from New York. It sat in storage for decades and decades. So we brought it back to life, and the story continues on with the object. It's not something from the past, it continues. And that was a beautiful learning curve for all of us that were involved, is that they could all be brought back and used within common sense. I think John mentioned, like, there's pesticides, there's a lot of chemicals used on stuff. Always have to be aware of that. But we'll dance our masks. We'll definitely take them out. Post-COVID, hopefully we could start having this happen. And here this shows the movements of the chest with clan members and people, and how the chest was used. We started using it in gift-giving ceremonies. Definitely going out of the norm for a lot of conservation standards. We put about 300 pounds of copper shields for gifts for chiefs and guests into it. And the chest was fine. I was definitely scared. And there's a look at the coppers. And there's the gift giving, where we could see it's on a hardwood dolly in the public here, being gifted out to the public. And there's the moon. That's the chief's crest. So we'd always show that out to the public first. There's me getting gray hairs. It was very stressful. In the movement of the chest with the very colonial, which was good in a sense. We had to unpack and pack it multiple times during a potlatch, and it was a 2-day potlatch, and it roughly started around lunchtime, just before lunchtime, to around 3 or 4 in the morning. So they always had to be packed up, unpacked, packed up, moved back and forth. And here's Gujao, Chief Gdansta, with his family saying goodbye to the chest after 2 years. And here it is in the lower right in our vault. So it'd have to be put back in the chest at 3 in the morning, and then brought back out at 11 a.m. lunchtime, and then brought into the hall and unpacked, and then repacked again and brought back. That was their standard. So in order to meet it, to keep this as a loan, we played ball, and like we all learned, but this was a good learning curve of what we could do and our capacity, and we rely on our own people for this type of loan. And here it is, one of its final places after the potlatch. And a stipulation in the loan and the conservation standards was it had to be put on display, and they had to be physically present to see it put in before they left to New York. And we made sure the moon was the first one that people noticed as they walked in to the museum, because that was our call as our clan. It's not our interpretation, that is just the real truth and the story of this object. This is the other object before I go. This came from the Canadian Museum of History in Ottawa. It's a box drum. I kind of put this in to show a conservator's report, condition reports, where we identified scratches and dings and various stuff to compare condition reports over the 5-year loan. And here's what we did to it. Gujao, we used it in ceremony. This was my father's ceremony. My father is the chief of a village where this boom box comes from. And the quick decision was made, well, it was made to be used. It was made for music. And he's a musician, he's an artist, he's a hereditary chief. So during one of my father's potlatches, we used it in ceremony. And we still had it for a few more years after that. And it showed no ill effects. It sounded beautiful because we have never heard a box drum like this. That we don't have any on Haida Gwaii. They're all over the world in different collections. And we're lucky enough the CMH had this in their collection, and we're willing to loan it to us for 5 years. I should note too, both objects in this presentation, the box drum and the moon mountain goat chest, were noted by our repatriation groups that went around the world in the early 2000s and found them in storage. And that's how we got our direction from our elders and our hereditary chiefs to get them on loan. And hopefully one day we can repatriate them back and they can be part of ceremony again. Hawa. Stop sharing. And I lasted, I didn't get cut off.
Thank you so much, Sean, not just for your wonderful presentation, but for managing to squeak it in there before you got your internet cut off again. It's going to be really hard not to jump into questions. I know I have so many. You've shown the process that you've gone through, how to bridge that gap between yourselves and the colonial institutions, and really interesting the lines that each of you were able to draw and come closer to. And clearly that's a process that will continue to evolve as more and more of these loans for use happen. We had met before and we came up with a couple of themes for discussion that we agreed that we would like to discuss, and we hope that you find value in that as well. And the first theme was, how do we move forward from here? And the first question within that is, given all of your experiences, and you've already spoken about this a bit in your presentations, but what do you feel is required at either the individual or institutional level to break from the colonial practices which are now normalized within these institutions? And if there's anybody who wants to jump out first, otherwise I don't want to target you.
Well, I can get the ball rolling. Can you hear me okay?
Sure can, John, thanks.
Great. I'm seeing a weird icon that looks sort of like a pine tree in my lower left corner. I haven't seen that before, but apparently it's not the mute button anyway. It's not the microphone. Yeah, well, I think within the Canadian perspective, as I mentioned in my talk, you can make reference to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and look up those museum-related articles comprising articles 11, 12, and 31, and really make those part of your daily workplace behavior. The articles speak to the rights of Indigenous peoples to control their cultural property, both tangible and intangible, and an institutional commitment and an individual commitment to adhere by those principles will manifest itself in some of the other instances that I described, for example, seeing to it that institutional planning documents, exhibition charters, strategic plans, include that mandatory UNDRIP compliance and legal duty to consult and Aboriginal and treaty rights compliance paragraph, whereby the institution and individuals are constantly questioning themselves. You know, is this proposal UNDRIP compliant? Is it Aboriginal and treaty rights compliant? Does it raise any potential concerns at all in respect of the legal duty to consult? So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Miranda, did you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yes, I think for me it is it takes a great deal of people acquiring a sense of humbleness in doing this line of work, being humble enough to understand that not everything is going to always go according to plan, and that's okay, and that not everything is meant to be shared by a community to the museum, and that is okay. And when I think of how institutions can move forward, it's about being very self-reflective on the institutional history. At least here in the United States, has a very hard time admitting that it was that the history of this state was built on the foundation of genocide in many different aspects. And so what it has to do is understand the museum in general, how have we as an institution, you know, perpetuated those ideas to the masses, and how do we help them teach them that we were wrong as an institution? It's very self-reflective and very important to do that work. And it starts by doing that work yourself and really getting to know who you are and your own history and your own relationship to the land and your perspective of Indigenous people, and actually then helping your institution move forward. And that can be really hard.
Thanks for that. And Sean, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, one thing that always stands out to me, since I do teach some university classes, and to break a lot of those old colonial practices, it goes to so many different facets in society, where our industry and stuff. I look at education, like within museum studies programs and stuff, like start with that. It'd be one good spot too. Is I have no clue how old these colonial practices are. I'm assuming they're probably 19th century, and have probably stayed there for quite a long time, with how a lot of practices have been done. That should be revisited and totally changed. Like, we're a progressive society, everything is changing, and there's no reason why this should not change. World's going to change around them. You don't want that. You want to actually be right up on par with what's like John mentioned, those articles within UNDRIP and stuff. That should be mandatory. That should be already implemented in universities that are putting out new conservators and curators and the like. Start with that young generation, as well as implementing it within in-house as well, is really good. I look at that with resource management issues that we have on Haida Gwaii. It's like we have to always try to change the old guard into changing their mind, but it's always education with the younger that are coming up that could implement the change as well. Would be really good. So I look at university programs too. It'd be a really good one to get those colonial practices. Pretty much they're so out of date to be changed, or just kind of removed, and just get more progressive with how stuff should be.
That's a really great reminder to those that are in positions of privilege of teaching, is being really conscious about what information is delivered, how it's interpreted, and questioning perhaps your own underlying training and how you're developing your curriculum. Yeah. So I think we've heard from a lot of people in the conservation community who work within institutions that perhaps are not at the place where they're willing to make this change. And change can be great, but can also, as Miranda talked about, it can be a threat. And if a conservator is practicing in such an institution, what advice can be given to them to how perhaps to be a change maker within their institution? How might they be empowered themselves to start making that change?
change is good.
Embrace change.
And in our instances, with our dealing with conservators, with our objects that were on in ceremony, it was, boy, they had to adapt, and because they participated, they were right there into changing on the fly, because we could not guarantee what exactly was going to happen, because most of our lives could be like put in a particular box that they like, and they're put into scenarios where it is not in that box and it's pretty fluid. And by participating and being around Indigenous communities of how we handle objects, how we see them, how we feel them, they're not a past object, we mentioned that, but just having that experience would really help change. And it really worked really well in our instance. And that proactive measure is like, boy, go be a part of ceremony with those objects that are in museums, and you'll have a whole different appreciation of what they really are, especially coming from the people and the nations that they're from.
And if I might jump in as well too, I would indicate, in this day and age, certainly within Canadian borders, and for any publicly funded institution at the provincial, territorial, or federal level, Canada's reconciliation agenda with Indigenous peoples is official policy. So conservators and other staff at institutions, public institutions, should not be shy in pointing out to their institutional leadership that it behooves them to, make it known that they support Canada's reconciliation agenda with Indigenous peoples, which in turn puts them better positions than potentially to follow up on different grant opportunities, program dollars, that kind of thing. So I just wanted to put that out there too. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That's a great reminder. Sorry, Miranda, go ahead.
No. I think when I look back on my experience co-curating of Polygon Women and Warriors, which is of the Crow Nation at the Field Museum, we took Field Museum employees with us to Crow Fair, which is the third weekend of every August, where it's called the teepee capital of the world, and had the Field Museum people sleeping in teepees at the curator's camp with her grandma and her mom and her brothers and her sisters, and going around and showing them how the community still engages with these pieces that are deemed as historical. And I had personal conversations with those in attendance from the museum on, as beautiful as this culture is, because it is, right? Our cultures are beautiful and vibrant and should be celebrated. It is also important to realize that there are still things on these reservations, including where we were, that if they were able to have access to their material items, that they could heal themselves and reposition themselves in a way that would allow them to feel that confidence that is there in being an Indigenous person. And when I think about how I can help advocate or help people become emboldened to advocate on our behalf, and especially in this field, it is just to be understanding that it is okay to be wrong. It's okay to be uncomfortable. It is okay to not agree with us, but what isn't okay is to be disrespectful and to deliberately feel that because your knowledge-based system is what you know, that it immediately gets rid of the Indigenous people's perspective. It needs to come, that humbleness again, being humble enough to understand that these pieces that we live with and breathe with are in many cases an extension of who we are in our histories, and therefore should be respected in that way, as well as our emotions and our perspective and what we bring to the table. And just letting us be the agents of our own cultural material is what I think.
So for those who are charged with the care of collections and institutions, it's just it is as much about, if not more, understanding the perspectives of the others. So not your schooling, but everything that you haven't been schooled on. And that is, that's, somebody once asked me, how do you judge? How do you judge? what is the thing to value? And I can't answer that. It's not my, as a conservator, answer to give.
And one thing I've been thinking about, and I don't mean to usurp this, is to ask oneself, why am I conserving this? Like, why? What is the purpose behind this? Is it just for the institution and the insurance value behind it? Or is it legitimately because you want to eventually allow community access so they can do with those pieces as they want? The reasoning, I think that reasoning and my personal basis will help you as an individual understand how you will approach this work.
Thank you for that. I think it's important to remember we now have some legal obligations that we can look to as employees within institutions that we can remind our managers and administrators of, but also a reminder that with flexibility and going with the flow comes success from many different perspectives. So if I may, we'll move to our next theme, which is something I think that a lot of people have been talking about, is what can community-focused conservation look like? And one question from that is, I think in these presentations and in some other experiences, we've seen some really profound examples of what community-focused conservation can look like for those who are privileged to work on projects that are guided and led by Indigenous advisors. But what might this look like for a conservator who does not have access to these lines of communication, or perhaps isn't supported to pursue them?
There's always somebody who will be willing to help. I think for me, when this comes up a lot, is it takes getting out of your own comfort zone of being afraid to reach out to people and to build a network, because you will be able to find people who want to help you. It's just a matter of how are you going to be willing on your own end, because the institution, again, will not always support you. But if you're doing it for the right reasons, then it should be on a personal level to be able to reach out to people and ask for help. And a lot of the time that is free labor, and that comes into another issue, I think, with this, is that is seen as, well, why should I do that when it's outside of work hours, most likely, or it's not a part of my purview. But if you're doing this work, and as Indigenous people, we work on 24/7 on this type of thing. It's never separate from our work hours. So I guess to me, it's like, how are you willing to show up? Are you willing to actually do the work, or are you just saying you're doing the work and then not having any action behind it?
And if I might, yeah, a lot of it has to do, and hopefully once we get beyond these pandemic conditions and everything, and there's something approaching a normal return to working life and that kind of thing, institutions, large and small, generally speaking, need to be much more welcoming and forthcoming with visiting Indigenous delegations. And like I say, there are various practical features that institutions can undertake, whether we're talking about smaller, regional and local museums, or some of the larger museums at the provincial and national level, seeing to it that you do have those specially designated spaces where visiting Indigenous delegations can be met with and greeted, and not just within sort of the standard museum boardroom or meeting room, making sure that you have the facilities in place and resources in place such that you can meet and greet with delegations in collection storage areas, in conservation treatment labs, in the gallery spaces. And, like I said in my presentation, there are a number of very practical steps that institutions can undertake to achieve this, in terms of having specially set aside areas, and not just within the interior of the building either, especially landscaped green spaces, outdoors, that's, in temperate weather, depending upon the season and where you're located geographically, I'd previously worked for a number of years at the Canadian Museum of History, where we're right along the banks of the Ottawa River with majestic panoramic views of the Supreme Court and the Parliament buildings on the far side of the river. And it was always a very special occasion when we did have visiting Indigenous delegations, and the weather conditions and other factors combined such that we could, rather than having our meetings inside the museum in a boardroom or wherever, we actually meet outdoors along the banks of the river, and a much more majestic and inspiring setting that way. So thanks.
Sean, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it should be, even though if they're not supported, like reaching out to all those communities, no matter what the politics are. Like we always get told, relationship building is key, and our networks that we have are key. We share them. We help direct people. The Haida Gwaii Museum, since we're one of the oldest in the West Coast, we are kind of leaned on heavily in the past to facilitate communication to other nations who didn't have anything. But luckily we're intermarried and we have relatively good relationships with everybody, so we could help create those links. And I think that's one of the keys too, is like just you really have to like communicate, especially nowadays. It should be a lot easier than it ever was to get a hold of people with our technology, and big or small, whether they have an institution or not, because a lot of them don't. That's always a bit difficult for some who want to facilitate loans or anything. They don't have, these facilities with, HVAC and security and so forth to house it. But I definitely would put the onus on them to do their research and to never give up, because Miranda's right. We do work 24/7. Like it's constantly Nika and I getting a lot of pokes to really help other institutions to reach out to get those, and it's working really well. And that's what I would always strongly recommend if they don't have them, but really create them. And relationships are key, and it really starts well with that.
Thanks for that,
And
Sean.
I think to jump off of that really quick is you're gonna have to like use Facebook or like Instagram. Like I think what happens with a lot of people, especially in museums that I've encountered, is like Facebook isn't formal, right? It's not formal, but of our aunties, cousins, elders are on Facebook, and that's the place where they'll answer you the most, and they'll check you out, and that's how we stay in contact with each other. And I think doing away with that formality essence that can be formal as well. You message someone exactly the same way you would in an email, and I guarantee you'll probably get a response faster than you would in an email.
That is so true, Miranda. We just had a project with the Humboldt Forum in Berlin where they sent very formal letters to the Hereditary Chiefs Council and our leadership. And they were like, what is this? What does this really mean? So what it took was Facebook messaging and cornering me either in a house or on the street saying, what's really happening? Give it to us. And that's, Miranda's so right. You have to use those lines, because very formal could get dropped and you get a non-response in a hurry. So keep it human, even though formals, but try tone her down a bit to not be so formal, because that's not how we operate. Formals are ceremony. That's like latch time. Yeah. So it could be dropped. She's still right. Facebook and everything else is a great way of how we get business done.
Mm-hmm. And I would add as well, too, I think if I might put this out there, of all of the museum and heritage related disciplines, it occurs to me that the conservation profession is a relative latecomer to the game. Like if you look elsewhere across the spectrum of the museum and heritage related disciplines, they've been talking about these issues around diversity and inclusion for some time now. And it seems to me that it's just within the past year or two, really, that this has really caught on within the conservation field. I remember much earlier in my own career when I was starting out, and I'm dating myself here, but going back to the late 1980s and into the early 1990s, when people were talking about indigenous issues and conservation, it was the latest advances in adhesive technology for, repairing quill work and that kind of thing. It never, if you tried speaking about, well, what are the ethical issues around this institution's retention of these cultural materials and having them subject to these conservation practices, people would look at you, or as they looked at me, as if I was from Mars. And well, I'm not, I didn't think I was speaking out of turn or speaking out of line or anything else. It all seemed a very obvious question to me, but it took some people really aback. So I'm glad to say now, that was sort of 1988. Now the conversation has moved forward to 2021. And these issues around diversity inclusion, it's not a temporary political movement. It will, this is the new landscape within which we all exist. And, the conservation profession must not be perceived as lagging behind as these discussions continue to be elaborated. We have to be not just participants, but actually putting ourselves out there in a leadership role to show how a profession can change and to show how an entire discipline can change to recognize these new realities. So, thanks.
Thanks for that. I am very reluctantly going to cut our conversation off. I really wanted to ask the last question, but we'll have to save it because we are running out of time and we have quite a list of questions from the audience to attend to. So I'm just going to swing those over. And the first question is for you, John. Mm-hmm. You mentioned that CCI is in the process of building, there's even more to that. So we understand that CCI is celebrating its 50th anniversary in the year 2022. Do you have any thoughts concerning this from an Indigenous or decolonial perspective?
Yeah, well, it raises an interesting point. Yeah, CCI came into being in 1972, and the foundation of the institution was one of Canada's national responses to the 1970 International Convention for Protecting Cultural Property. And they had to hit the ground running. There was money that was available in the moment. They had to make the best possible use of it right off the bat. And I guess I think it was a missed opportunity because the priority automatically became recruiting a cadre of mid-career conservators from abroad and then bringing them to Canada and then identifying a small group of, recent college and university graduates within Canadian borders and bringing them on for training within CCI's own in-house conservator in training program. And there was no effort made at outreach to Indigenous groups or representative organizations at that time. And as I say, it was a real missed opportunity. There was a burgeoning contemporary Indigenous art movement. We're talking 1972, so it's within 5 years of Expo 67 and the pavilion that I mentioned previously. The contemporary Indigenous art movement that we still recognize today was in full swing by 1972. There was a very vibrant Indigenous craft movement that was out there and that was being manifested in different ways in different parts of the country, but there was never any attempt at outreach to Indigenous participants as the Canadian conservation profession was being founded. And that's a real missed opportunity because right from the get-go, there could have been a distinct and unique Canadian conservation profession that would have incorporated unique Indigenous features, but that wasn't, it wasn't acted upon. And here we are, a situation 50 years later in 2021, and we're talking now about Indigenous issues in conservation. There was no reason why we couldn't be having this kind of conversation in 1972. And so I'll just, leave it there and put that out there, but that's one response to that question. Thanks.
Okay, I think this is for all participants now. Kind of a two-parter, but we'll start with what advice would you give conservators working in institutions with upper management that believes we've already collaborated enough. Example, we've worked collaboratively in the past with local communities to develop gallery spaces and policies surrounding the care of sacred and ceremonial objects. So we've done it, we can move on with our work now. And I would assume this is coming from somebody who feels that it's not the case, that collaboration is an ongoing commitment, not a one-stop shop.
Mhm.
Sorry, I'll go ahead and, well, okay, I mean, you don't have
Yes,
to be as
of
bold
course,
as
okay.
me, but I would say something along the lines of, well, if we have already done everything and we have already given everything back, have we already incorporated policies that allow for access to our collection on a more, on like a better basis where you don't necessarily need to like have sign-in sheets? Like, what is the policies and the different aspects that you have done to create to make your space more Indigenous friendly? Because you can work with one group at one time, anytime, right? You could work with me today and then hire me tomorrow, or like not consult with me. But have you actually done any of the changes that are needed to ensure Indigenous perspectives are not just a part of the conversation, they are the conversation? And that you notice that there are Indigenous interventions throughout your museum, as are people who are Indigenous on your board, or do you have Indigenous curators, do you have Indigenous collection managers, do you have Indigenous board members? Who and what is being represented on that level beyond just we work with them one time? Because that's the same, in my opinion, of saying, well, I have an Indigenous friend. Well, you might have an Indigenous friend, but then what are you doing to support the causes that are continuing to harm us or to be used against us? That's just my opinion, though, and that kind of question makes me heated because I've encountered that as well.
Is there anybody who would like to add anything to that, or before we move on to the next one?
I'm sorry, I got distracted by a comment in the chat there, so I missed the last bit of that. I'm sort of getting, it's been, I'm into like hour 12 of my working day so far, so I think I'm starting to lose my focus a bit.
There's a lot going on too in the chat. So why don't we jump on, because we have not a lot of time left before the wrap up. But I think here's a good one, because it has I think a reminder could be made here about legal obligation to consult with UNDRIP. How, as we can as conservators, continue to evolve our practice to include and amplify Indigenous voices and perspectives within institutions with management that doesn't understand, support, or see the value of collaborating with Indigenous source communities, in the care of Indigenous belongings. And there's another one that is quite close to this. How does one advocate with upper management when upper management sees indigenizing the museum as a threat to productive research in other departments? Example, natural history, having to get permission from source communities to collect specimens in national parks that are unceded Indigenous territories.
Yeah, and if I might, in a situation like that, if we're talking about a publicly funded institution at the provincial, territorial, or federal level, it's not an administrative inconvenience, and whether or not the institutional leadership likes it, there is a legal duty to consult. It's an issue that has been settled at the level of the Supreme Court of Canada in major decisions, including Mixu Cree. There are 3 or 4 of them that lay the groundwork for this notion of the legal duty to consult. So it's not an administrative inconvenience. It's not a nuisance. Frankly, if the institution wants to stay in operation, it is what it is. It is the legal duty to consult and accommodate Section 35 Aboriginal and treaty rights holders. So, and again, institutions should be in a position where they want to position themselves as being at the forefront of these issues. It gives them a credibility that they otherwise lack during this ongoing era of global museum decolonization and indigenization. So, thanks.
This is becoming very difficult to pick questions.
I didn't know if Sean wanted to say anything because I can say something as well. So I don't want to
fly at you, Bill.
Well, I wasn't laughing at the question. I was laughing at the institutional response, because I've heard that before. And how do you get upper management to do it is, I guess for me, advocacy is anything that you are comfortable with. Like, we're all advocate and are activists in a way that is comfortable for us, because we all have different positions in this life, right? So I don't have kids, I'm not married. I'm able to do and say things probably in a different way than those who do have those characteristics of their household will, and I can take risks in a different way. But when an institution says, like, where the research is going to suffer, I think about, well, what is that research purposely doing for the community, if at all? Is it just to continue to perpetuate the violence that is set up by colonialism? Or are you actively researching on something that will benefit the community and its longevity? Because as much as institutions like to believe that they're these houses of education, they're the houses also of continual violence against Indigenous people. The more that they hold on to our human remains, the more that they hold on to sacred items. They are not just like passive people or groups, they are actively continuing in the perpetuation of violence against Indigenous people. The more that they say, we don't need to give things back, or we don't want to do this. If you're doing that, then you're complicit in the way that violence is continuing to be manifested, not only in Canada, but from my United States experience. And we have NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, which gives all of the power to museums on determining if they give items back to a group of Indigenous people. And so why are we protecting institutions? Why aren't we trying to help the people who we took from?
Yeah. And I would add as well too, that through, we have to consider research agendas, research strategies through an Indigenous lens as well. And I would recommend everybody's attention to RCAP Appendix E, Ethical Guidelines for Research. RCAP is the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. That was the final results of which were released way back in 1996. But the ethical guidelines for research, at least, have stood the test of time. So I would look into those. I would look into the Tri-Council policy statement on research with human subject matter, the Tri-Council in question being the Natural Sciences Research Council, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council, and the Medical Research Council of Canada. Also, the OCAP principles of ownership, control, access, and possession. And there are a number of First Nations governments at the community level that have promulgated their own research ethics and review processes. So you can do a Google search on my own community, Six Nations of the Grand River, and look for the conducting research at Six Nations, which is a Band Council approved document that stipulates the conditions under which external researchers will be allowed onto the territory and permitted to interview band members for the purposes of their research in whatever discipline. So, thanks.
That's great. The Haida Nation, we've done the same thing. We were kind of gatekeeping research. There's been enough books on the Haida Nation been published with no Haida involvement, or maybe spoke to one or two, and it's published, and it's in academia, it could be gospel because it got to publication. So whether it's natural history or cultural, we have research committees within the nation and with the museum creating policies. So starting to reject researchers from anywhere in the world, whether from Canada or the US, because it's not benefiting. It kind of perpetuates the same problems that we're having with research. So we're like, maybe we should research ourselves before we let everyone else start writing books on Haida culture and society, whether it has to do with museums or natural history on Haida Gwaii. So we're just like your Six Nations, we're just starting to create policies and procedures and really looking through and going through everything. And we'd be really polite when we do reject people, and we are gatekeeping nation-based scholars, which are leaned on heavily, which is probably quite similar around the country, which are getting either exhausted or they really don't know why people are bugging them, and they'll do an interview. And before you know it, there's books published quoting people, whether they're from museums, and that becomes very problematic in our own legal Haida society when those steps aren't goes through Haida protocol, our own ways of being within a nation that we have to like, safeguard and make sure they're followed. And we had to write them down for God's sakes, because we know oral culture, but we have to start writing everything down and make them into laws that everyone else has. So we started to do that, and it's a bit of a process, but it works really well.
I'm just looking at the time, and I'm expecting Lauren to pop in at any time and tell us we have to stop. I don't want to. I have more questions. There's three more pages of questions.
And we could try asking just one more question if everyone is interested. Yeah, let's go for one more, since we had about 10-minute interrupt. So
Okay, because there's a really good follow-up question for Sean based on what you have just said, which is going back to the need for conservators to consult with community. And the comment here is relationships, definitely. But does it ever start to feel extractive? All of these people, all of these museums wanting information from you. So not just information, but guidance. And it goes to that question of, can I vacuum this belonging without asking somebody about it? Where is that line between need to consult and careful, informed stewardship?
That is interesting. That gets brought up quite a bit if people phone and say they're doing something, or, oh, you're right, like a lot of stuff could be extractive, and where's the reciprocity in what's ever going on with anything. But with revolving care, like say dusting, as you mentioned, like working on poles or masks, geez, that's so difficult, because, or even a stone tool, it's like, good God, I'd say almost a common sense that you're not going to phone me about microblade cores. Hopefully not, if you have a few thousand in your collection that you're cleaning or relabeling. That's a very difficult question. It almost have to do with almost working on a backing it up and working on projects with institutions on what they have, significance of those objects, those precious items, if they're ceremonial, if they're burial, if they're shamanistic, personal regalia, if they're frontal poles or mortuary poles, that could be straightforward. That yes, please clean them. I worked at Mo and I got to watch them clean, which was great to see the level of care that goes in. But I think it'd be to work with the nations or the indigenous communities first and understand like what they really have. But that could be a task in itself. Capacity building, there you go, for interns, and like for work, is to really understand what you really have, because when we hunt around collections around the world, we just started. There's so many objects out there, and it's going to take a long time. But it's almost a triage of like what you do have in your collection. You could almost have a triage or a priority list of where you would want to consult, like headdresses, chief keys, and ceremonial objects for sure. If it's a stone tool or a mall head or an adze, well, I would be quite comfortable saying, please do whatever, those type of tools. But that would require a lot of research and a lot of groundwork, a lot of pre-work before that. I could see that being what I would like to see being done, because we do get politely bugged a lot about collections of what should be done. But it's like, we just do a research project, let's all work together and understand like what we really have. Then we could bring it to our people, to our clans, our elders, and they will direct us on what should be done. Because that's what we're here for, is we're here to be directed by our people on how stuff should be cared for. And the more we know what's out there, we could really help like the handling and caring of objects, right to the dusting and the cleaning of stuff, that's for sure.
So it really speaks to the moral obligation, the responsibility of the institutions themselves to better understand the holdings that they have and make sure communities know where they are so they can create those links back again. And then you start asking the questions around stewardship. So it's individual stewardship plans with each different community, or as best as you can, just start.
Yeah, start somewhere, absolutely.
And when I give land acknowledgement talks, because we're still in that process here of like, what is a land acknowledgement? One thing I always am telling people is, if you want to actually even begin to work with an Indigenous group, you as an individual have to confront the biases and the internalized concepts that you have about Indigenous people and actively work against them. So that way, those internalized thoughts, because it's not our job to consistently talk to you about like, okay, well, I'm triggered and it's because of the history that is you should be able to do that groundwork for yourself in many ways, just understanding, the history of the land that you're on, who was from it, what is their relationship now to it, where are their items, how have we treated them, and giving that knowledge to the people instead of saying, instead of asking them to come to you and to do the work, you go to them and say, this is where we're at, we are not doing it well, we know that, and how can we help you in what you're doing? And is there some way we can be reciprocity, and then letting the people who come in to do collaboration or consultation set the terms to what they are going to be consulting on, meaning maybe they don't want to tell you something about a bag, and that's okay, but noting that in your own notes, so that way it lives in the archive and in the system, so that way when the next person comes in 30 years later, they can see that so-and-so said just not to share this, and then they can determine, maybe it is time to share it. It's having to keep up very archival records is, especially as we go forward, is especially important for consultation as well.
Thank you for that, and thank you to all of you for your time, your comments, and your perspectives. And I will pass it back over to Lauren.
Thank you so much. I feel like we could just go on for hours. There's just so much that I know the CAC membership really wants to learn and start practicing. And with that, I'll just kind of remind everyone that the RWG is just forming. It's been a slow process. It's getting there. It's feeling good, and we're getting off the ground. And so there should be more events like this coming up soon. Best way to kind of keep in touch is to check our blog once in a while, and we're hopefully going to start building like a mailing list of some sort, so we can reach people beyond the CAC as well, since there are a lot of you that tuned in who are not members. And so as Heidi said, thank you so much, Sean, Miranda, and John, for your time and wisdom. And Heidi, thank you so much for moderating this discussion. We're really grateful for everyone who attended and engaged, and I know it's late, and so we're really grateful that you can be here. We're also really grateful for those who have donated funds to this event. It really helps us kind of move our work forward. The RWG is a grassroots initiative, so it really does help. And finally, I just wanted to say we will be sending out a short evaluation post-event through, I think it's a SurveyMonkey link. We should get it to you tomorrow or in the next couple of days, but I just wanted to say thank you in advance for taking the time to fill this out, because this will help us improve the events for the future, and it'll also help us with the hurdle of funding applications as well. So thank you for taking the time to fill those out. And yeah, we'll be in touch by email. We're happy to share the recording after this event. And again, we apologize for those who couldn't make the first half, but more soon. I'm wishing everyone a great evening. Thank you.
Hawa.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Have a good night.